Los Angeles is a city built on the premise of forgetting. It is a place that erases its own past with every new development, paving over the old world to build a bright temporary illusion. But there are fractures in that illusion, places where the concrete does not take, places where the history bleeds through. In the autumn of 1926, before the great highways carved up the basin, and before the hillsides were blanketed in glass and steel, 3 men walked into the rugged mountains overlooking the city. They were not prospectors looking for gold. They were municipal surveyors carrying heavy brass instruments and leather-bound ledger books. They went up into the thin air to map the wild ridges for the city's endless expansion. And they found something that was not supposed to be there. A door, forged of solid black iron, set flush into the side of a granite cliff face, thousands of feet above the city streets. There were no roads leading to it, no historical records of its construction. On October 14th of that year, they forced that heavy iron door open. They walked into the dark, and they never came back out. To understand how 3 men could simply vanish from the face of the earth, you first have to understand the Los Angeles of the 1920s. It was not the sprawling metropolis we know today. It was a boomtown, drunk on oil and desperate for water. The population was exploding at a rate that terrified the city planners. The Los Angeles Aqueduct had been completed just over a decade earlier, bringing water from the Owens Valley, but the city was already outgrowing its supply. The Department of Water and Power was frantically surveying every canyon, every valley, and every mountain ridge in the San Gabriel Range, looking for places to build new reservoirs and catchments. The San Gabriel Mountains are a strange geological anomaly. They are some of the steepest, most rapidly rising mountains in the world. Even today, they remain incredibly hostile and difficult to navigate. In 1926, large swaths of these mountains were essentially unmapped territory. They were a jagged wall of granite and chaparral that stood in stark contrast to the orange groves and oil derricks of the valley below. In early October, the city dispatched a 3-man team to map a remote section of the range, near what is now known as Mount Disappointment. The assignment was routine. They were to take topographical measurements, assess the bedrock for potential dam construction, and return within 2 weeks. The team was led by Arthur Pendleton, a 42-year-old veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers. Pendleton was a man of science and exact measurements. He had served in France during the Great War and was known for his meticulous. Accompanying him was Thomas Vance, a local geologist who knew the Southern California rock formations. The 3rd man was Elias Thorne, a 24-year-old draftsman and apprentice surveyor. It is because of Elias Thorne that we know anything about what happened on that mountain. Thorne was required to keep a daily field journal, logging their coordinates, weather conditions, and topographical notes. This journal, recovered weeks later, remains one of the most baffling documents in the history of the American West. The ascent began on October 4th. The men loaded their mules with provisions, canvas tents, and the heavy, delicate tools of their trade: theodolites, transit levels, chains, and plumb bobs. They departed from a small base camp near the mouth of the Arroyo Seco and began the brutal climb upward. For the first few days, Thorne's journal entries are mundane. He notes the oppressive heat of the Santa Ana winds, the difficulty of moving the mules over loose scree, and the endless blinding glare of the sun on the white granite. By October 8th, they had reached an elevation of roughly 5,000 feet. They were completely isolated. The sprawling grid of Los Angeles was visible below them through the haze, a silent checkerboard of distant lights, but they were entirely cut off from it. On October 9th, the tone of the journal begins to change. Thorne notes that the compasses began to behave erratically. The needle on his transit level would drift, pulling inexplicably toward the north face of the ridge. Thomas Vance, the geologist, attributed it to a localized deposit of magnetite in the rock. But as they pressed further into the canyon, the anomaly grew stronger. By the evening of October 10th, the men were forced to rely purely on celestial navigation, as their magnetic instruments had become completely useless. And then came the entry on October 11th. Thorne's handwriting, usually sharp and disciplined, appears hurried. The entry reads, "Pendleton spotted a structure on the north face at 14 naut hours. We assumed it was an abandoned silver mine from the 1880s, but upon approaching, the premise is entirely wrong. There is a door set into the cliff. It is made of a dark, heavy metal, possibly iron, though it shows absolutely no signs of oxidation despite the marine layer moisture. It is perfectly flush with the granite. Vance cannot understand how the rock was excavated. There are no blast marks, no tool marks. The stone around the metal frame appears perfectly smooth, almost melted. The discovery made no logical sense. The location was inaccessible by wagon or truck. Hauling a door of that size and weight up the sheer face of the mountain would have required heavy machinery, cranes, and a massive labor force. Yet there was no trail, no debris, and no record of any mining operation in that specific quadrant. Thorne spent the next 2 days sketching the door and the surrounding rock face. These sketches, preserved in the county archives, show a massive rectangular slab, approximately 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. There were no hinges visible on the exterior. There was no handle, no keyhole, and no visible locking mechanism. It was simply a blank, imposing face of cold metal. Pendleton, a man who abhorred a mystery, was determined to understand what they had found. He believed that the door must conceal a forgotten cache, perhaps old Spanish gold, or perhaps an illegal bootlegging operation, though the logistics of transporting liquor up that high seemed absurd. On October 13th, the men abandoned their surveying work entirely. They focused solely on the door. Thorne writes, "We have spent the last 12 hours trying to find a seam. Vance struck the metal with his geological hammer. The hammer rebounded with a force that nearly broke his wrist. The metal did not ring like iron. It absorbed the sound entirely." Pendleton pressed his ear to the metal this evening. He claims he can hear a low, rhythmic vibration coming from deep within the mountain. I listened as well. It sounds like the distant hum of a massive dynamo far beneath the earth. Vance thinks it is merely wind moving through subterranean fissures. Pendleton is unconvinced. On the morning of October 14th, they decided to force it open. They did not use explosives, fearing they might collapse the cliff face or bury whatever was inside. Instead, they used the tools they had. They drove steel pitons into the microscopic seam between the iron and the rock. They rigged a block and tackle system, anchoring heavy ropes to a massive ancient pine tree. For 6 hours, the 3 men worked the winch, pulling with all the mechanical advantage they could muster. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the journal records that the door finally moved. It did not swing outward. It groaned, a deep earth-shaking sound of metal grinding against rock, and recessed inward, sliding back into the mountain on hidden tracks. The final entry in Elias Thorne's journal is dated October 14, 1926. It is brief. It lacks the usual scientific detachment. The door is open. The air coming from inside is freezing cold, and it smells of ozone and burnt copper. The tunnel goes straight back into the dark. The walls are not carved. They are smooth like glass. The humming sound is much louder now. Pendleton has lit the kerosene lanterns. We are going in to determine the depth of the shaft. We will leave the journal here at the camp. We should be back by nightfall. They were not back by nightfall. They were not back the next day, nor the day after that. Down in the valley, the Department of Water and Power had expected a routine telegram, or a signal flare from the ridge by October 18th to confirm the completion of the survey. When a week passed with no word, the city grew concerned. It was not entirely uncommon for men to get lost or injured in the San Gabriels. A broken leg or a sudden rock slide could easily trap a team. On October 22nd, a formal search party was organized. The search was led by a veteran Los Angeles Police Department detective named Frank Hodiak, accompanied by 4 park rangers and 2 local trackers. They followed the mapped route Pendleton had filed with the city before their departure. It took the search party 3 days to retrace the surveyor's steps through the hostile terrain. On the afternoon of October 25th, they found the camp. Detective Hodiak's official police report is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. But reading between the lines, the scene they encountered was deeply unsettling. The camp was in perfect order. 3 canvas tents were securely pitched. The mules were tied to a picket line, half-starved but alive. A campfire had burned down to cold, white ash. Sitting on a flat rock near the cold fire was Elias Thorne's field journal. A theodolite remained mounted on its wooden tripod, pointing directly toward the sheer cliff face. Hodiak and his men followed the line of sight from the instrument. They walked up the slope toward the granite wall. They found the heavy ropes. They found the block and tackle, still under massive tension, tied off to the ancient pine tree. And they found the door. It was wide open. The dark rectangular void gaped like a wound in the side of the mountain. Hodiak, drawing his service revolver, ordered the rangers to light their lanterns. They stepped across the threshold, moving slowly into the freezing ozone-scented air that Thorne had described. What the search party found inside the mountain defies every known law of physics and architecture. According to Hodiak's initial report, a report that would later be heavily redacted by the city, the tunnel did not lead to a sprawling mine. It did not lead to an ancient catacomb. The tunnel went straight back into the rock for exactly 32 feet. And then it stopped. It was a dead end, a solid, flat wall of dark stone. The search party scoured every inch of that 32-foot room. They tapped the walls, looking for hollow spaces. They searched the floor for trapdoors. They looked for hidden crevices or vertical shafts. There was absolutely nothing. It was a single, seamless corridor of rock that ended abruptly. But there were two details in that room that haunted Detective Hodiak for the rest of his life. First, the walls of the tunnel were not carved with pickaxes or drills. Hodiak brought a geology expert from the local university to examine the site 2 days later. The expert concluded that the rock had been subjected to instantaneous, localized heat of unimaginable intensity. The granite had not been chipped away, it had been melted. The walls were vitrified, transformed into a smooth, dark volcanic glass. To achieve this effect in the 1920s would require temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, concentrated perfectly in a rectangular tunnel. No technology on Earth could do this in 1926. Second, the dust. The floor of the tunnel was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of fine, gray dust. Hodiak held his lantern low to the ground to look for footprints. He found the boot prints of Pendleton, Vance, and Thorne. The tracks led from the doorway straight down the center of the tunnel, but they did not turn around. The footprints walked all the way to the solid, vitrified wall at the end of the tunnel. And right at the base of the wall, the footprints simply stopped. There were no tracks leading back out. 3 men walked into a dead-end room with no exits, and they vanished. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. The Los Angeles Police Department, notorious in the 1920s for corruption and for prioritizing the city's public image above all else, realized they had a severe public relations problem. The city was trying to attract investors and real estate developers. A story about municipal workers vanishing into an impossible, melted cave in the hills above the city was not the kind of press the mayor wanted. Within a week, the official narrative was constructed. The LAPD released a statement to the local papers claiming that Arthur Pendleton, Thomas Vance, and Elias Thorne had staged their own disappearance. The police suggested the men had grown tired of their families, succumbed to the immense pressure of their debts, and had fled across the border to Mexico, leaving their equipment behind as a ruse. It was a classic, heavy-handed police cover-up, and it was entirely unsupported by the evidence. The wives of the missing men fought back. Pendleton's wife, Margaret, produced bank records showing that her husband had just deposited a substantial sum of money into their savings account, planning to purchase a home in the newly developed Hollywoodland tract. Vance was expecting his first child. Thorne was engaged to be married. None of them were in debt. None of them had any ties to Mexico. But the police refused to reopen the investigation. The men were legally declared dead, and the case was sealed. Elias Thorne's journal was confiscated by the city. It was locked away in the basement of the Hall of Records. For years, the story of the Iron Door became nothing more than a whispered rumor among the surveyors and water engineers of Los Angeles. A ghost story told to frighten new apprentices, but the mystery did not end in 1926. History has a way of leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, even when those in power try to sweep the floor clean. 8 years later, in the winter of 1934, Los Angeles was gripped by a strange and sensational news story. A mining engineer and self-proclaimed inventor named G. Warren Shufelt appeared on the front page of the Los Angeles Times. Shufelt claimed that he had invented a device he called a radio X-ray machine. He stated that this device, utilizing advanced electromagnetic frequencies, could penetrate the Earth and map underground voids. Shufelt used his machine to map the Los Angeles basin. He submitted his findings to the city council, sparking a massive controversy. He claimed that entirely beneath the modern city of Los Angeles, there existed an ancient, intricate network of tunnels, a subterranean labyrinth built by a lost civilization that predated the Native American tribes of the region. Shufelt claimed these tunnels were perfectly engineered, shaped like massive cylinders, and lined with a strange, glass-like substance. The city council initially permitted Shufelt to begin drilling in downtown Los Angeles to prove his theory. But after a few weeks, the permits were abruptly pulled. Shufelt's maps were confiscated. The excavations were filled in with concrete, and the inventor was dismissed as a fraud and a lunatic. He died in obscurity. But if you look at the surviving copies of Shufelt's underground map, copies that were smuggled out of his office before the city raided it, there is a detail that connects directly to the events of 1926. Shufelt mapped a main arterial tunnel running beneath the city, stretching from downtown all the way toward the San Gabriel Mountains. The line on the map ends abruptly at a specific coordinate. If you take that coordinate and overlay it onto a modern topographical map of the mountains, it points exactly to the ridge where Pendleton, Vance, and Thorne disappeared. Did Shufelt know about the iron door? Did his primitive radio machine detect the vitrified, glass-like walls of the tunnel the surveyors had opened? Shufelt claimed the underground civilization used advanced chemical heat to melt the bedrock, creating smooth, glassy tunnels. The exact same phenomenon described by Detective Hodiak in the Dead End Cave. We will never know for sure because the city ensured that the iron door could never be opened again. In the early months of 1942, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the west coast of the United States was in a state of panic. The military believed a Japanese invasion of California was imminent. The War Department seized massive tracts of land across the San Gabriel Mountains to build anti-aircraft batteries, radar stations, and military observation posts. The ridge where the iron door sat was annexed by the United States Army. The area was declared a restricted military zone. No civilians were allowed within 5 miles. According to declassified engineering logs from the Army Corps of Engineers, in March of 1942, a military construction battalion was sent to that specific peak. Their orders were highly unusual. They were not instructed to build a radar tower or a bunker. Their sole objective, listed in the ledger under a vague geological stabilization code, was to seal a cavity in the rock face. For 3 days, heavy transport trucks hauled wet cement up a hastily graded dirt road. The military poured over 4,000 gallons of industrial concrete directly into the tunnel. They filled the 32-foot shaft from floor to ceiling. They poured concrete over the iron door, over the stone frame, and over the surrounding granite, creating a massive, featureless scar on the side of the mountain. When the war ended, the land was eventually returned to the National Forest Service, but the site was forever altered. Today, if you know the exact coordinates and if you are willing to brave the treacherous hike through the overgrown chaparral, you can find the spot. You will not find an iron door. You will only find a massive, unnatural slab of aged concrete, blending in with the gray rock, hiding whatever lies behind it. The records of Arthur Pendleton, Thomas Vance, and Elias Thorne have mostly rotted away in forgotten filing cabinets. The police reports are buried. The city moved on, building taller skyscrapers, laying down wider freeways, continuing its relentless campaign of forgetting. But the questions remain, hanging in the dry desert air. What was the rhythmic humming vibration Pendleton heard through the metal? What technology could melt solid granite into glass in a perfectly straight line? How did 3 men walk into a dead-end room, leave footprints in the dust, and simply cease to exist? Perhaps the LAPD was right. Perhaps it was all a grand illusion, a complex escape plan devised by men who wanted to leave the world behind. Perhaps the tunnel was just an anomaly of nature, a strange volcanic vent that defied all geological explanation, and the men merely fell into an unseen fissure. Or perhaps Los Angeles is truly built on top of something older, something that does not sleep, something that, for one brief afternoon in 1926, opened its door and let the surface world inside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize.